I'm Sally Berkman. Welcome to the May Forum program, Roebling and Immigration. Before I introduce Sam Stevens, here's a preview of coming attractions. On June 21st, Laura Neitzel, familiar to many of you, and the daughter of a Pennwood resident, Jan Neitzel, will speak on Youth in the Age of Global Disruption. And on July 19th, Bucks County author Jeffrey Marshall, past president of the Heritage Conservancy, will offer Bucks County Farmhouse, an icon explained. They will both be here in Penn Hall in person, so save the dates for those interesting programs. And now tonight's main attraction. If you've lived in this area for a while, you may be familiar with the Trenton Makes Bridge. Have you seen it? Yeah, I figured. The current bridge, which opened in 1928, replaces bridges dating back to 1806. It's there primarily because Trenton, at the head of the navigable Delaware River, has been, in its day, the site of industry and manufacturing since the 1600s. Trenton provided iron, steel, rubber, pottery, flour, cloth, and weapons for the American Revolution. The slogan, "Trenton makes, the world takes," was originally intended for good publicity for the city, and how it came to adorn the bridge is another story. In 1848, John A. Roebling moved his wire rope operation from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. Incidentally, he was an immigrant himself from Germany. In 1870, the Roebling Factory was producing 700 tons of wire rope annually and had 85 employees. This wire rope was used in construction of such bridges as the Brooklyn Bridge, the San Francisco Bay Bridge, and many others. By the early 1900s, the Trenton factory had outgrown its space. Roebling created a company town nearby, named, of course, Roebling. We can learn more about the town another time. To discourage forming unions, Roebling imported most of his workers from Eastern Europe. By 1918, 3/4 of the employees were from Sweden, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and Romania. The recent discovery of boxes of employee records has provided detailed information on nearly 900 men who worked in Rope Shop Number 2 at the Trenton factory. Sam Stevens has been analyzing these records to answer the question, why are some workers who emigrated to the United States considered American, while others were not? Were they considered American as identified with their country of origin, like Hungarian-American, or just Hungarian? How was the process of becoming American influenced by public attitudes and the political circumstances of the day? Are there parallels with migration issues today? Sam Stevens is well qualified to answer these questions with degrees in sociology from Reed College and the University of Michigan. Though mostly retired, he's the vice president of CAPD, Center for Assessment and Policy Development, where since 1991 he has conducted research in human development, social, and educational services. He was also a senior survey researcher at Mathematica Policy Research, designing and directing large-scale data collection and evaluation projects. As a member of the Trent House Association Board of Trustees, he has expanded the association's interpretation of slavery, Native peoples, and immigration. Please welcome Sam Stevens to Pennwood.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit about what we've been learning from these exciting records that Sally referred to, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how they came in under our scope, so to speak. You'll see here that there are two names listed here as authors of this. Matthew Sue I think he's probably a college student now, but in 2020 and early 2021, he was a high school student in the West Windsor School District and became an intern at the William Trent House Museum in Trenton, New Jersey. And he worked with me on this project. And as you can see, we originally presented this in January of 2021. I've added some additional information to the presentation, but the analysis and the conclusions, our interpretation really has remained the same. So I want to continue to give credit to Matthew for his work on the project. But since 2021, the Trent House has formed a partnership with the Roebling Museum, and I think some of you will be making a trip to the Roebling Museum soon to see what's left of the factory there, to learn about the life of the workers in that company town. They received a gift of about 13,000 employee records, mostly from the 1930s through 1950s. Which will complement the ones that we have here that we've looked at, which were from the early 20th century. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the William Trent House Museum. It's a National Historic Landmark. It stands on the traditional land of the Lenape people. It was built in 1719. By William Trent, who was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant and an immigrant himself from Scotland. In his household with his wife, his youngest son, and enslaved Africans who worked in the house and others who worked in his fields, farms, and orchards. Oops, there we go. The building and the grounds were given to the city of Trenton in 1929, restored by the WPA, and are now furnished according to Trent's probate inventory of 1726. So at some point, I'd love to have you come and visit the house. So let me tell you a little bit about how this project came about, which is really a collaboration not only between Matthew and myself, but between the Trent House and the Trentoniana collection, which is housed at the Trenton Free Public Library, and it really collects a whole range of things from china to flags to commercial signs to archives, city directories, and so on. So one of the things that it turned out that there were boxes of records that someone had given to the Trentoniana collection, 4 basically shoebox size, of Roebling Factory records. And one day I was at the library, and Laura Pohl, who was the librarian and the archivist there, showed them to me, and it was fascinating to look at them. And you'll see some examples. I will show them to you. I was intrigued by them. I thought, great, this would be a great project to really look into, but I was too busy at the time. So the next serendipitous thing that happened was Matthew showed up. He called us, he reached out and asked if we had any opportunities for summer internships. At the time, this was just as COVID was hitting. It was in March of 2020. I was a little focused on other things at the time, so I didn't get back to him right away. We tried again. I said, let me get back to this young person in May of that year, and fortunately he was still available and still interested. So that was the second lucky thing that happened to us. And this coincided with the Trent House working toward a new mission of, instead of focusing solely on the 1719 house and William Trent and his family, to really look at the broader group of people back to the Lenape, forward into the industrial era that lived and worked in Trenton, and particularly were connected with the Trent House property. And you can see our new mission statement there. So here's our industrial landscape. The map you see there is an insurance map. maps that were done in great detail to help determine insurance prices, costs, and viability, I guess, of insurance for properties. And so each lot is drawn there. On the lot is drawn the outline of the structure. The colors indicate different types of building materials, brick, frame, stone, etc. And you can see in the central of the block that's marked 61, where it says Edward A. Stokes, Esquire, that's the Trent House property. And that sort of largish pink building with some yellow around it, that's the Trent House as it was when it was given to the city. It had a lot of additions on it from Gilded Age. So there it sits, and on the all sides of it, and we don't have the side that's on the other side of Warren Street, but all three sides around the Trent House were working class neighborhood housing. To the west, across Fair Street, between the Trent House and the Delaware River, were factories. And so the Trent House, this little piece of property, about 2 acres, was surrounded by people who worked in factories and the factories themselves. So this is really a connection that the Trent House has. The photograph is a photograph that was taken in probably 1936 at the dedication of the museum after it was restored. And the men who are standing on the right-hand side giving speeches and so on have their back to the Trent House and are facing the Delaware River. Then you can see the gathered assembly there, but behind them you see the large factory, and this was probably the woolen mills that you can see on the map itself. So we were right in the middle of Trenton's industry. So why is immigration an important part of Trenton's story? Well, clearly Sally's already given you a hint for why that's the case. Immigration was a major factor in Trenton's growth, in its industrial development and so on. Initially, English and immigrants from the British Isles formed the backbone of the pottery industry, which is one of the early industries in Trenton. German and Irish immigrants arrived in the 1800s as well. And as we can see, and as Sally has mentioned, Roebling himself was one of those immigrants. And you can see that there was a fairly quick turn in Trenton from a relatively small proportion of people coming from foreign-born from various countries, England and Germany and Ireland being very prominent in 1900. By 1920, you see many other groups, Italy, Poland, and so Czechoslovakia, becoming more and more prevalent in Trenton's foreign-born population. And in 20 years, it went from English, German, and Irish immigrants being about 70% of the foreign-born to about 23%. So it was a very massive and quick change in the demographics in Trenton. And that was due to the growth of industry. Trenton today is still a city of immigrants. We have many, many Central American restaurants. People have come here from Central America, and other immigrant groups include those from Liberia and the former Soviet Union. So Trenton is a city of immigrants, has been a city of immigrants from its very founding. The Roebling Wire Works factories were a major factory, a major employer in Trenton. And Sally's given you a little bit of background on John A. Roebling. Here's his portrait here. He was born in Prussia. He was trained as an engineer in Prussia, but he left there because of various factors were not making it possible for him to gain work as an engineer, and because of political unrest. So he and several others immigrated to the United States, and they settled in Pennsylvania, where he first started with farming. Eventually, he did start going back to his profession, began promoting suspension bridges. He had studied this in Europe and was trying to convince people that suspension bridges were feasible. He moved to Trenton, as Sally pointed out, in 1848, and one of his major projects that he took on was the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. He injured his foot when he was doing a site visit, essentially, to the construction. He sort of refused medical care. He had his own way that he wanted to take care of himself. Unfortunately, he contracted tetanus, and then he died in 1869, and he is buried in Riverview Cemetery in Trenton. His sons took over the business. The eldest son, Washington, who had been trained as an engineer, with his wife, Emily, really finished the work on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I have heard a talk, by the way, about Emily Roebling and her powerful role in making that happen. There was another son, Ferdinand, who I've heard a little bit more about this evening, who expanded the wire rope business in Trenton. And then Charles developed an additional procedure for creating a very thick wire rope, and he founded the town of Roebling basically as a company town, and you will get to visit there, I hope, soon. So these are some images of the factories, the Roebling factories and other factories in Trenton in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Massive, huge brick buildings that you can see there, particularly on the right-hand side, many of which stand today in Trenton. Empty, most of them, but they're still there. Some are being converted into loft apartments, retail and office space. We're excited about that, rather than see these buildings stand empty. But during the time they were active, they were employed hundreds of workers. It was a major employer in the city. Here's a couple of pictures of the factory in action, so to speak. These are, this one here is of Building 7. I don't have any pictures of the actual site where the records of these workers that we were able to analyze actually worked. But this is an example of those buildings. This is one of those very big brick buildings, lots of windows and so on, but lots of open space. Huge spools of wire rope were produced there, and there you can see the scale on the right-hand side. So what did the Roebling factory record about its workers? Because this is what we want to jump into, is what can we learn from these records that we just came into our understanding. We just found them. They were, and it was an example of how we can use these records to really understand about the workers and their work lives. So these are the kinds of things that the records showed. And what's interesting is there's many things on here that would be typical of an employment record. Your name, your address, maybe your age, your next of kin, and so on. But there are many others that would not now, I think, be relevant to many employers. So here's some examples. I'm going to show you some examples of the actual records themselves. Now, one of the interesting things about these, and these were all from the 1918 to 1923 period, they all have pictures, little photographs of the person themselves. It's amazing to actually see the people there. It records the kind of information we just talked about. Now, this man is described, as you can see here where it says nationality. He's got his age is 24, he's single, doesn't have a family. His nationality is Russian, Polish, American. You can see, if you follow along, he was a naturalized citizen. Going down, you can see that he spoke English and read English. And he actually has multiple languages that he speaks, but apparently was not educated or literate in any of those languages before he came to the United States. Here's another gentleman, 26, single. He was listed as Slavish. Slavish or Slavic were very commonly listed as nationalities. He was also a naturalized citizen. He also spoke English, and he was literate in his native language, but you'll notice that he is not listed as Slavish American or Slavic American. Here's another guy. He was the first listed as Hungarian. They changed that to Magyar American, which Magyar, I think, was also considered Hungarian. He's naturalized. He could speak English, but only read it a little bit. But he could read in Hungarian. I'm going to do a couple more. Here is an American. He clearly must have been born here. He is 35. He didn't need to be naturalized. You'll notice his trade was a potter. As I mentioned earlier, the pottery industry was a major industry in Trenton early on in particular. At this time, it was in the process of transition from being a skilled craft to one that didn't require the same level of skilled work. And you can see that he quit. You can see that he worked at the Great Western Pottery Company. He was employed there for not very long, and he quit because the work wasn't steady enough. At that time, the skilled workers who had been required for the pottery industry were no longer required because of additional technological changes in the industry, and so he was looking for something else because he couldn't get steady work in his trade. And I think this is, we've got a couple more. This man is Polish, Austrian, Polish, and American. He was naturalized, couldn't read English well, and here's our last one. He was a German-Hungarian as his nationality. Perhaps, he's young, he's 21. We did find some records, by the way, of young people in their teens. Perhaps he came to the United States with his family because it says, where it says naturalized, says his father has his papers. So it's possible that he came with his family. Now, most of what we paid attention to on these records for this analysis was the kind of data that we've just been talking about. Their age, marital status, ethnicity, their literacy, and so on. But as you can see, there's some additional information that we didn't look at yet, which is where they were employed before, and several other things. So the back of the paper, of the record, this is the back of one, indicates what the quality of their work was, their productivity, why they left Roebling, etc. Notice on the reasons for leaving, it includes things like agitator and insubordination. This was era before unions, and there was a great concern about unionization. So there's lots of data that we can look at with these records, but we haven't done that yet. More to come. So what did we begin to observe about what was recorded for the workers' nationality? So our first task, these records were, little cards about so big, they about fit into a shoebox. The first thing we had to do was scan them. So those images that you saw before were scanned records, and then we had to code that information so that we had about 900 individual records. So we couldn't just sort them, we had to code them. And they all worked in a particular part of the Roebling plant, which unfortunately I don't know a lot about, which is the Department 50, Building 2 on Hancock Street. That building still exists. It no longer probably looks the way it looked back then, but I haven't found anybody yet who could tell me exactly what they did in that particular building. So as we were scanning and coding these records, we began to notice some patterns that began to make us curious, particularly about nationality and how people were described in terms of their nationality. Now, we noticed also, I'm going to go back a little bit here. So you'll see, in general, the words that are put on the record itself is filled out by someone other than the employee, and it shows up a couple of places. You can see that the signature there is not the same style as the record itself. So one of the things that we noted or believed was that the records were filled out by an employee, by someone, a clerk, who was filling out these records. So this was how someone other than the person himself described their nationality. Another piece of caveat, though, I need to say to you is that while there were a lot of these records, 900 of them, they undoubtedly represent only a small proportion of all of the people who worked in the Roebling factories, and we don't know why those particular records were saved. We don't know what proportion they were of the total employment population, and we don't really know why these records and not other records. So that's something to keep in mind. So we can't really say this is typical of all of Roebling's workers. However, we did see patterns. So for example, some employees were assigned a European-American nationality, and you could see that on some of the previous records. So for example, we see Irish-American, German-American, Polish-American. But some people who came from the same European country, Ireland, Germany, or Poland, did not have that hyphenated addition of American. So because we believe that the staff of the plant, not the employee themselves, completed the record, something about the staff perceptions and judgment influenced whether an employee was considered American or not. So that became sort of a question that we had. So here's an example. So of those 900 records, about a quarter were listed as American only, like that gentleman we saw before. About a third of them were some European nationality plus American. Almost half, not quite, were European-only nationalities, and of those, 13% of that 46, no, of all of them, 13% had two European nationalities. So a big chunk of the workers, half of them were only European, but if you add the plus American, you've got a huge proportion that had some connection with European immigration. So here's some of the frequently recorded nationalities: German, Hungarian, Italian, Polish, Slavish. A few were reported less often. The earlier immigrants that would have come from England, Ireland, and Scotland, from other parts of Western Europe, and some from the Eastern European areas, a very few Scandinavian. So why did we end up focusing on employees from Eastern Europe? You'll notice the title of the talk was The Americanization of Eastern European Immigrants. Many of Trenton's immigrants were Eastern European. We've kind of gotten that picture before, but here's an example from the 1920 census for Trenton that indicated the percent of the foreign-born from specific areas, specific countries, or some of which maybe don't exist today. But all of those countries, about 50% of the foreign-born population of Trenton were from those countries which are sort of fall in the Eastern European group. So that was a major part of Trenton's population. Similarly, many of those folks were coming from Eastern Europe, and here's the breakdown by specifics. Now, if someone were a double listing, they in some sense got counted twice. So if you were Hungarian-German, you got counted both as German and Hungarian. But just as a way to give you a sense of what were the number of worker records out of those 900 that came from those specific countries. So again, you see German, Hungarian, Polish, and Slavic being most frequent. We included Germany here, by the way, as Eastern European, although we might not think of them today as Eastern European. We tend to think of them as Western European. But in the 1800s and up into the beginning of the 20th century, there were many small kingdoms, city-states, and so there was a lot of flux in Germany at that time, very similar to the changing boundaries and political alliances that were true of other areas to the east. So we included them there to see how they might, what their experience might have been like. So one of the things we had begun to notice is that people who came from Eastern Europe didn't seem to have that hyphenated American label given to their nationality. And this was borne out statistically because anybody who was in those previous categories, if they were listed as being German, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, Slavic, only about 8% of them were considered American, Hungarian-American, Polish-American, Slavic-American, whereas the other European groups, almost a quarter of them were considered American. So this begins to give you a sense that something's going on with this particular group of immigrants. Why are they not being considered American in the same way that people from other parts of Europe? And then when we broke it down within the Eastern European group, we see that there's a big range there. Between 50% of people from Austria, a quarter of people from Russia were considered American, Russian-American, Austrian-American. Whereas you look at Hungarian, Romanian, Slavic, Slovak, those are very unlikely to be given that American linkage. So we began to be really curious about why this was so. Here were our questions. Why were immigrants from Eastern Europe less likely to be considered Americanized than those from other parts of Europe? Why were immigrants from some areas of Eastern Europe more likely to be considered Americanized than immigrants from other areas in the same region? And what were the factors that influenced potentially we appear to influence the perception of a nationality, of Americanization, on the part of the Roebling staff filling out the employment forms. Okay, so we took a step back to kind of look at the big picture of what was going on in Europe and the United States at the time, to kind of get a sense of why this might be. So in Europe, there were many factors that were pushing people to immigrate to the United States. Civil unrest, war, economic turmoil, and the changing boundaries, national identities, and so on. So all of these things were going on. We have a little chart here that shows some of these rebellions and revolutions, war taking place. Civil unrest and economic unrest, the potato famine, the emancipation of the serfs in Russia, political changes. So all of those things were factors that were pushing people out of Europe. And John Roebling was actually an example of that. A little earlier maybe than some, but the wars and the struggles that affected Prussia, the economic downturn that made him finding a job as an engineer very difficult, were all things that affected his decision to immigrate to the United States. So on the flip side, what was happening in the United States at this time? So we have some periods of immigration, and following those we have some reaction. The nativist riots, people concerned about the waves of immigrants moving in and what was going to happen to people's economic well-being, taking jobs and so on, and political standing, the Know Nothing Party. Some of you who are maybe political scientists or historians maybe could tell us a lot more about these particular factors. There's a second wave of immigration, and this is probably where most of our people that we're talking about today came from. And there were then beginning to be legislation against immigrants, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a Red Scare, and then in 1924, the immigration quota laws became enforced. So there was a response in the United States that while employers were looking for inexpensive labor that they were getting from immigrants, at the same time there was a lot of concern politically and publicly about what these waves of immigration were doing to our country. And so that was the kind of context in which these workers were being classified in terms of their nationality and their Americanization. So here's just a quick statistical look at what happened between 1850 and 1930 in terms of the numbers, total numbers of immigrants that went from about, a little more than 2 million in 1850 to 14 million in 1930, and where they were coming from. Many, many from Europe. Okay, so then we begin to think about what affected whether these particular workers were considered American or not. What can we figure out? What can we know that might affect that? So these were the 4 factors we thought might make a difference. Were they naturalized? Had they gone through the process of becoming U.S. citizens? That's the one that seems the most obvious. If they had done that, they would be considered American, whether it would be Hungarian-American or whatever. Were they able to speak and particularly read English, so they had made an effort to become assimilated? Were they likely to be educated, which may be indicated by having a reading proficiency in their native language. At least in their native language, they had been educated. And did they have a skill or a trade that might make them more valuable as a worker and more likely to be potentially to be assimilated and accepted? So here's what we see in terms of the naturalization status of 4 of our groups. And these are the 4 groups we're going to keep looking at because they had enough people in them that we could look at some patterns. So you can see that there's some differences. Germans and Hungarians, about half of them had become naturalized. Polish, somewhat less. Slavic, somewhat less. So maybe this was accounting for these differences in whether or not people were considered American. So here's what happens when you add in the factor of are they considered American if they're naturalized. So let's start with the Germans. So about half of them had been naturalized. Most of them had then achieved, or many of them had achieved the status of being considered American. They were German-American. They were no longer German by themselves. Thank you. Then you go down and you see the Polish is very similar pattern. But look at Hungarian and Slavic. Even though big proportions of those people had been naturalized, very few were considered American, even though they had been naturalized. They'd become U.S. citizens. So that didn't seem to really help us explain why some were American and some were not considered American. So let's look at some of the other factors. So English language proficiency. Clearly the Germans and Hungarians were ahead of the game, so to speak there. The Polish and the Slavic were less so. Maybe this is a factor. Again, what you see is the German and Polish, you have very similar patterns in the sense that about a quarter of the people who were able to read English were considered American. But even if you could read English, if you were Hungarian or Slavic, it was very unlikely that you would be considered American. We're going to look at the native language reading. It's going to show the same pattern. Oops, a little too fast there, sorry. Sorry, I don't know how I got going so fast. There we go. So again, you can see, even though this is this pattern is not as striking, but if you were Hungarian or Slavic, you didn't fare as well, even if you knew how to read in your own language, in terms of being an American. Having a skill or a trade, again, Hungarian, even if you had a skill or a trade, you weren't very likely to be considered American. So what's the common theme? Well, the common theme is where you came from, whether you were German, Polish, Hungarian, or Slavic. So why? Why were some of the nationality groups more likely just because of where they were from, to be considered American? So then we were sort of asking that question, and we sort of thought about what it is that people were thinking about when they thought about these different nationality groups. And race was a way that people thought of nationality groups in the early 20th century. So as you know, race is a way of categorizing groups of people. It's used all the time. We think of it primarily in terms of color, black, white, Asian, Native American. But racial categories were applied to white people, to different ethnic groups within Europe. And they're hierarchical. It's not just there are these people and these people. It's always in a sense of hierarchy. And of course, whoever developed the racial categorization system were the ones that were considered their own group to be on the top. So if you were English and you had a racial categorization system, English people people from the British Isles were considered at the top level. If you were German, it was your population that was considered at the top. And as I mentioned, European populations were categorized by race until recently. And there were scientific evidence was produced to try to explain this, or try to justify it, I guess I should say. So eugenics was one, where people began to assume that social behaviors and mental characteristics were correlated with genetics and were differed by race. And here's an interesting example where somebody was showing types of social inadequacy. So first of all, you can see that people were considered socially inadequate for a wide variety of reasons. They could be feeble-minded or insane. They could have committed a crime. They could have epilepsy or tuberculosis. They could be dependent, that meant economically dependent. So you sort of lump all of those together, and then you sort of rank everybody to how likely was it that that group would be socially inadequate. And by the way, this analysis came from an analysis of an institutionalized population. So it didn't even start with looking at the whole world. So this was the kind of analysis that was done to kind of talk about race and to define certain groups as less valuable, less competent, more likely to introduce problems into our society. Also going on at this same time is sort of a back to our roots movement in the Colonial Revival movement, where people were looking back to the good old days of the colonial times when Trent was there, and people were coming from England. And we felt like this was the traditional stock of our country. And that was what was Anglo-Saxon, and like I said, the Anglo-Saxons were considered sort of the top of the rung, and everybody else was sort of not quite there. Here, for example, just a really quick example from the Trent House. This is a snapshot out of a painting that was done in 1923, and it's an idealized scene of William Trent standing there holding a wax with a candle, so he's going to put his seal on the deed that he's signing to purchase the land where the Trent House is now. But this is an example of the kind of sort of, this is where we come from, this is our heritage, this is what our country is about. And at the same time, political cartoons gave us a real window into people's attitudes about immigration as a whole and about specific groups who were immigrating. So one concern was economic competition. So here you see someone from who knows where, but clearly an unsavory character, taking the bread and butter off the table of an American worker. Oops, sorry. I have no idea what I do to this to make it do that. Okay, there we go. So then we have misplaced allegiance. So here we were, a Protestant nation, being threatened on the shores by, if you can see that, those are bishops' mitres, as if they were crocodiles or alligators attacking the innocent Americans on our shore. And then again, political and cultural danger. So immigration is sweeping us away, taking Uncle Sam and the flag with us. And even if assimilated, there was a concern. Are we Americanizing them, or are they Europeanizing us? There was a concern about radical political philosophies being brought into the country. by Russians, Slavics, and so on, Bolsheviks, and so on. And the response was policy actions. So the only way to handle it was to narrow the funnel. Now, before 1924, primarily, at least for Europeans, there weren't no quotas. There was open borders and so on. 1924, that began to be closed. And it now became much harder to get in, and there were quotas set by country from where you came from. So as we think back to why certain people were not considered American, I think we have to think more about the political and social attitudes of our country and our concerns, and why some people from certain areas were less likely to be considered American, even after they came to the United States, learned the language, became naturalized, and so on. It had a lot more to do with the fears that Americans had about what was happening to their country and what was going to happen to them, people who had been here before. And I guess one question to ask ourselves is, how different is that today? What is it about our situation today with a different set of immigrants from different parts of the world? And is there any lessons to be learned from thinking about this story of the Eastern Europeans who worked in the Roebling factories in the early 20th century? Thank you. And I would love questions or comments, particularly anybody who's got any experience with. I've had people who've had relatives from the Roebling factories. I've even found some of their great uncles and so on. But if anyone has questions or comments, I'd be very happy to entertain them as best I can.
Thank you. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask some unfascinating, detailed questions.
Sure.
About terminology.
Yes.
And I'm going to forget the terms that you used, but one of them was Hungarian, and one of them was Slavic or Slavish, and then there was German, and what was the other one?
Polish.
Polish, yes.
Yes.
Those are really strange combinations if you look at those countries today.
Yes.
And so I don't really understand where the terminology came from, except you must have taken them off the charts that you were looking at.
Yes.
So they were the perceptions of people at the time. Because, for instance, Poland is a Slavic country.
Right.
There's no doubt about that. Hungary at the time was part of something called the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
And the Austrians don't seem to be very visible in that mix, but the Germans are.
Right.
So were the Germans really Austrians, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or were they really different?
Well, that's a really interesting point, because during this period, there were a lot of shift, and I'm not a European historian, but during this period, there was a lot of shifting boundaries and political alliances and whatnot. The words that I use, the Polish, Russian, Slavic, were directly taken off the records. So how it is that they decided what it would be called. Now, they certainly were not looking at the genetic heritage, if you want to say, or the language families, which might be the ways today we might like to group people. They were looking at whatever kind of political boundaries existed at the time to identify people with. And, you know, we don't now generally use the word Slavic ourselves. I mean, that no longer defines a particular country or region. And my guess is that at that time, because of the turmoil that was happening in that particular part of Eastern Europe, that generic sort of title got attached to Czechoslovakia, you know, and those kind of areas where things were very disorganized. So all I can say is that this was how the Roebling worker who wrote down on the card decided to categorize people. A good point, though. One other thing that I wanted to mention that we didn't consider, but we could, as a factor, was how long they had lived in the United States. Now, census records in some years do tell us the date of immigration. Not every census has exactly the same questions. But one of the things that would be good to go back and do is see if some of the groups of people were more likely to have immigrated more further, you know, earlier, and that might explain why they were considered American more likely. Maybe if they were German, they had been here longer. If they were Polish, they had been here longer. So questions to explore. Any other questions? There's a question. Just a second. Sorry. You didn't, I'm sorry?
I didn't hear you say anything about Jews.
There were, I think, 2 records that specifically indicated Hebrew or Jewish. Now remember, they were thinking of nationality, and it's also the case that while Trenton has a large Russian and Polish Jewish population, they may or may not have worked in the factories. Again, there was prejudice. There were no African Americans. There were no blacks, none in those 800 records. There were no women. Now, by the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, in those other records that I told you that the Roebling Museum got, we do see African American employees. We do see women employed as janitors and clerical and so on. But again, this is a group that we're not so sure how representative it is. But my guess is that the prejudices of the time were influencing who got employed. Roebling was not known for being very open to everybody. You know, and particularly, I mean, Jewish people, for example, tended to be often to be seen as radical and perhaps promoting unions, which Roebling was very much against. Now, there was a question back there.
Okay. Thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering how, can you hear me?
A little louder.
I was wondering how much effect there is of the person who was filling out the card. If they were primarily one ethnic group, Roebling was German, did they mostly have German people fill it out? And that's why Germans were so high? No, I think that's kind of interesting too, and there didn't seem to be any record of who was filling the cards out.
No, and from just looking at the signatures, it's clear that, or the handwriting, it's clear that there were different people. So there was a mix of people who were filling the forms out. We don't know anything about who they were, but you're right that the individual who is filling out the form is making a judgment call, making some kind of assumption or analysis of something that says, okay, this person's clearly Hungarian. Am I going to call them Hungarian-American, or am I just going to put down Hungarian? And there's a... Oh.
Not to muddy the waters, but we are trying to do ancestry tracings, and my grandparents came from Poland, Austria, Germany. It's very difficult. On the manifest, they came across as Polish. By the time they were here for a while, and my grandfather went to work for Roeblings, they took his Polish name and said, John A. Roebling doesn't really like those Polish names, so you're going to be Schultz. And, and my grandfather was Schultz, and my mother was the 10th of 10 children, and she and some of the younger boys actually went by the last name of Schultz.
Right.
And nobody knows why, if that was true or, what happened, but Schultz they were.
Schultz they were. Germans had been coming to the United States from early in, even in the colonial period, but early in the federal period, early in the Republic. So they may have been more generally accepted as a whole. And, quite possibly somebody in the somebody in the factory said, you'd better have a German name. It'll help you better here. Could well be.
My question is, I noticed there are no Southern Europeans, no Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek.
There were Italians. That is another group we could have looked at because they were also, like Eastern Europeans, they tended to be sort of said, not so good. We're going to be classify them. And the racial hierarchies would classify Mediterranean and Eastern Europeans as sort of low on the totem pole of racial categories. We didn't look at them because we were interested in this question that we began to see why some people from some countries that we would classify as Eastern European seemed to be accepted as American and not. So we were trying to really tease that apart. It would certainly be very useful to look at the Italians as well to see what circumstances or what issues were they facing, for sure. But there were very few of the other groups you mentioned.
In the town of Roebling, were people divided when they went into the housing? Were they divided by these different countries?
Very interesting you should ask that. And I hope if you get to Roebling, you'll talk to the director, Lynn Calamia, excuse me, about that. And she will show you a map, essentially, of the housing at the time. And it was divided in two ways. The main part of the housing would start with the factory and sort of move back. The closest housing was row houses, very small, and so on. Those were the workers, the frontline workers. As you move back farther and farther away from the factory, you got bigger homes, the next level up of employees, supervisors, and so on. The managers of the company had very large mansions almost along the river. Now, that was also superimposed on that was some racial grouping. So there was a section for African-American workers, that was where the African-American workers had their housing. And another section, I believe it was for Romanian, I think so, another section for Romanian. But ask Lynn about that because she can show you that map and tell you what they know about how the workers were segregated in the town. Great question.
In New Hampshire, when I went to Berlin, New Hampshire, when I was young, preschool, I was warned. I was...
Nice and loud, please. I have hard hearing myself.
In Berlin, New Hampshire, when I was a very young child, I learned what different people from different countries were. One came down from Canada, to Berlin, New Hampshire. Every place with a different country. You walked around the street, you didn't cross streets, people didn't talk to each other, but everything was peaceful. By the time I was through high school, everybody was together, getting together, and today you wouldn't know that there have been so many countries identified within that country. And I was glad to see that because I was afraid, I was really afraid. I walked the curb because I was afraid to walk somewhere from somebody from a different country. So this could happen. I hope that other people know that that type of thing could happen wherever they were. At that point, I was 4 years old.
Yeah, yeah. That sense of in-group and out-group, is something that you develop, very young. And to some degree, this happened as a protective factor for groups who were facing some kind of discrimination or prejudice against them to sort of stick together. I think it's a natural human way of thinking is to try to group people or group things, create groups, create categories. And categories by themselves aren't necessarily the concern. It's when you rank them and sort of say some are desirable and some are not desirable. Is where we run into problems, I think, in our society. Thank you very, very much for attending. I hope many of you get to go down to Roebling and see it for yourself. I'm sorry?
2 degrees from here.
Yes.